Although the American model of the prophetic ministry has been minimized to focusing solely on personal prophecy, foretelling, and fortune telling, the role of the prophet in the mind of God is far deeper than that, far broader than that, fundamental and foundational. It was God's design to build the church upon the foundation of apostles and prophets. Prophets serve as guardians of covenant faithfulness to remind the church where we have deviated from the heart of God, and serve as blueprints, architect, designers for the future. Where is God taking us? And as we've been looking at the deviations that have been normalized in the church, from not only the focus and the function, the role of the church in the world, but the role of prophets and the prophetic ministry in the church, prophets and apostles from around the nation have joined us here tonight for a prophetic summit. We're going to have a series of conversations to look at what's going on, what is the state of the Black church, what is the state of the prophetic ministry in the church, and what are the solutions that will lead us into the future that is more aligned with the mind of God. So stay tuned as we take a look into his mind.
Before you can truly influence others, you must first win them over. In Winning People and Mastering Influence, Bishop Stan Williams offers a powerful guide to help you do just that. The key to leadership starts with understanding and empathy, building strong, trusting relationships that form the bedrock of influence. By leading with integrity and creating win-win solutions, you can foster a positive environment where both you and your team can thrive. Empowerment is at the heart of building a great team, one that not only follows your lead, but also rises to lead others. Discover how to unlock your full potential as a leader. Purchase your copy of Winning People and Mastering Influence today at thechurch320.com/shop and start your journey towards becoming the leader God has called you to be.
My question now is, if God has built the church upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, how is it that we have normalized marginalizing apostolic and prophetic ministry, where apostles and prophets and apostolic and prophetic culture has been pushed out into the margin? And how do we see that showing up in the systemic issue we're looking at in the church today? Any of y'all can jump in there.
I'll jump in by saying this. I think that at large, people are afraid of what they have not explored. And because they have not explored it definitively or exhaustively, they tend to pull back from it because it is not acceptable. The term, the title, the function of apostle and prophet, necessary. It is fundamental. It is foundational and a cornerstone of the church. However, I think pastoral positioning and the title of pastor has become really the widely acceptable term and office that people can understand. And because of that, it goes back to the point of reduction. We tend to reduce ourselves based on what culture at large cannot embrace, digest, and understand. And so the need for exhaustive exploration is paramount.
One thing I've seen that has bothered me over the years, and I really emphasize this to my leaders, is that everybody and their mothers are apostles or prophets, right? They left pastoral, they left evangelism, teacher. No one wants to be there. I've talked to people where they say, oh, I'm only a pastor. I mean, come on now. People did not want to be apostles or prophets until it became popular. Once it became popular, everybody and their mama wanted to be one, right? Or was one. So I think there's, going back to identity, which I love that you guys talked about. In Matthew, the 4th chapter, the devil came to Jesus and tried to get him to doubt his identity, both as far as divinity and he being human, right? If thou be the Son of God, if thou. That's what the enemy comes to do with us concerning identity. And some people have birthed ministries out of rejection, out of hurt, right? And they try to find their identity within the church, right? And what happens, it ends up shipwrecking because they weren't called to that office, but they claim that office, if that makes sense. Right. So I think we have to be careful in terms of really praying about what God has called us to do and God has called us to be, because I've seen people start off as pastors, next thing they're apostles, chief apostles, master prophets. It goes on. And it's based, I believe, out of a lot of rejection, a lot of hurt, and people will birth churches out of hurt and anger, right, and resentment, and going back to social media. If I can't preach at church, I'm gonna start off on social media. I'm gonna get on Facebook and start my church and do all these things. So we have to understand, and we have to understand even when we look at a hybrid of a pastor, say, prophet. I'm a pastor prophet. But the whole thing about that, there are hybrids. There are people that emphasize one or called to the other, but are really both. So I think we have to really, really be careful in terms of accepting assignment, know that God called us to. What happened to fasting and prayer before you enter something? What about hearing from God? Before I was even a pastor, I prayed for like 3 years because I didn't want to do it. I got the call, but I ran from it. And then when I finally embraced the call, that's when I could fully walk in my office.
I think one of the challenges that we're faced with as a community of believers is that the pastoral office has become the safest because of the abuse and the misuse apostolically and prophetically. Reared in apostolic and prophetic culture, father pastored for 64 years prior to transitioning, I've been familiar with the good, the bad, and the ugly of both the apostolic and the prophetic. So one of the reasons why it's been excluded out of most expressions in this hour, it's solely because of the abuse and the misuse of it, and the misrepresentation of it.
Wow.
And I think that's been systemic.
Yeah, the misrepresentation, I just want to jump in here, because I think that when we start talking about distinguishing between the prophetic and a prophet, I've been teaching on this for a while to bring the church at large to an understanding that what we fell away from, we didn't fall away from church. We good at doing religion. We've fallen away from kingdom, which is dominion and ruleship and authority and power, which is God's government. So we use terminology that sometimes we're not understanding, but when we say the prophetic really is the spiritual and supernatural realm. So that realm, he said he wished that we all prophesy. So what we're falling away from is that we're falling away from spirituality. So we're finding ourselves, we're good at doing church. We know what it is to sing songs and read scriptures and, have titles. But what we're lacking is character to function in the title in which we say we hold. And so people look at people who show up in title, but there's no integrity, because I question, are they officers? Absolutely. Because we have a lot of gifts, but they're not officers. People who are officers are distinct in who they are, because they're going to make sure they represent the priesthood the way in which God called them into doing it, because they've had to process into it. They understood the consecrations. We're falling into performance, and we're leaving now, drawing into God's presence. Any person who came into a legitimate call of an office, they've had to process through purifications. They understood what it was to stand in a place to become now qualified to function, not just in a title, but function to hold it at its place in the earth, to measure back something that qualifies from heaven back into the earth that God was pleased with, and he can put a signature on it. I think that when we show forth the true nature and character of Christ back into the office, you will find few people running to it. People have run to the office or ran to the title, because we have made it look as if it is about getting Bentleys and buildings. And this is not about getting Bentleys and buildings. If we're going to function in the apostolic, we need to understand that it's bigger than even being a bishop. All apostles are bishops, but not all bishops are apostles. And we have to deal with some of the stigmas and the religious postures we've taken that has caused us to not have the power to deal with and legislate things coming out of the spiritual places, to deal with the principalities that we're warring against in our regions and in our nation. And so this is some of the things that I've seen. We have titles, and we're doing well with titles, but we're not holding no type of spiritual altitude that we're able to ascend to deal with ruling powers that is taking us out by tropes in our world, because we won't deal with the heavenlies, the terrestrials and the celestials, demons of darkness that is challenging many that are running back into positions of pastoring because it's safe, okay, instead of trying to come to a place or fighting to come to a place that we're dying daily to take on more of Christ, that we can deal with the divinity that rises in us, that we're able to now bring articulated that through our humanity to show people the balance of who God is and how he rules in the earth in both.
One of the dangers of having our identity in God constructed for us, as you touched on, Bishop Griffin, by a different culture with a different assignment, is then it gave the power to demonize our spirituality. Right? To Apostle Cynthia's point, that part of our unique call and assignment were to be the custodian of the spiritual graces, the spiritual gifts, and spirituality at large in the time and the culture. Go ahead, Bishop.
I'm so glad that you said that. But I wanted to speak on it. This is where I was going to. I actually cut off because I felt like I was talking too long. But my point earlier that I was making about is how we came into the United States as a people being deemed uneducated. So we lack the language or the verbiage to articulate our experiences and thoroughly communicate our expressions. But our people have always had the grasp on a pure relationship with God. And it's also a misnomer that we would even say that our people didn't have the language of the scriptures, because black people carried the gospel to Europe. So that's a whole nother cat of another color, but we'll talk about that another day. But my whole point was, how did we lose? You asked, how did we lose that apostolic and prophetic edge? I'll tell you how. Because we took our people and we put them through seminary and theology where they were taught the doctrine of cessationism. And there you're taught you can't be an apostle, you can't be a prophet, you can't be an evangelist, you can't be a pastor teacher, because those gifts have ceased. Right. So because those gifts are no longer in operation, then you can't move in your apostolic function. Right. I think another problem is not only education, the problem is functionality. Right. Because we don't understand the difference between the ascension gifts and the administrative offices. Right. The bishop, the elder, the deacon, these gifts are for the local church for the purposes of administration. Those individuals should be trained how to operate in the church. But ascension gifts should be trained on how to impact the world. Right. The apostles impacted the world. When you see the prophetic rise up in the book of Genesis, it's through Moses. And Moses goes back to Egypt and he affects an entire kingdom. The monarchy was redefined in Egypt because a prophet came to the city. When you look at Nehemiah, a whole city is reconstructed and the Persian king gives him the authority to go and be a governor in Jerusalem as he rebuilt the walls. See, these prophets understood that their assignment wasn't to stand in a pulpit and to call people's last names, their social security numbers, and their address. These prophets understood that their primary impact was to declare the judgment, the will, the counsel of God, and to ensure that his kingdom was established in the earth. And as a result, when they impacted a region, they didn't just come to the local church to hold a revival to get a seed offering. They spoke to kings, they spoke to governors, they spoke to princes. And by the time Jonah got through in Nineveh, the king put the whole nation on a fast. Even the dogs and the cats were on a fast. And everybody came to repentance because a prophet came to town. You see, that's what happened in the 50s and the 60s. We don't call him that, but Martin Luther King was a prophet. He was a prophet. And because he discerned the heart of the people, prophets are put in the earth to communicate the heart of God concerning his people. The priests speak to God on behalf of the people. The prophets speak to the people on behalf of God. And so the prophet's job is to communicate the mind and the heart of God in the earth. And so when God heard the expression of the cries of his people coming out of Egypt, what did God do? He raised up a prophet. When there were cries coming out of Jerusalem, he sent himself, embodied in the womb of a virgin, and he came down and he shifted an entire governmental system, so much so until the disciples, we say the disciples misunderstood it. I think the disciples were on to something even though they misinterpreted it. The disciples kept expecting him to become an earthly king. Why? Because Jesus moved with so much dominion in his authority in the earth that everywhere he went, cities and regions were impacted, so much so until when he arrived, even Herod was threatened. He killed all the babies under 2 because he knew that Jesus, he expected Jesus to become his earthly replacement. My point is, when we remove the prophet from the sanctuary and release them back to the systems of the earth, when we remove the apostle from putting on garments and walking in pulpits and laying hands on more people to become more apostles to operate in the context of the church, then we will reclaim our prophetic edge in our culture, in our time. We are not functioning in the systems or the frameworks that we're supposed to be, because we've been trained how to work ecclesiastically, and that's for the administrative office, not ascension gifts.
Wow, that's good. And I'll go a step further. When we remove the prophetic from our DNA, and the danger becomes when we are being taught our assignment and our identity by a culture of people and a mentality that stands to benefit from us not knowing that culture, right? And so now our spirituality, you made a point that there was a time we didn't have the tongue of the learned, but what we never lacked was the eye of understanding, the ability to see, the ability to discern, the ability to language, and without titles, without having all of our abilities to move through the serendipities of the English language or finesse, we had within our DNA the capacity to bring the mind of God, the heart of God into the times and to mobilize a people behind that mind. And so what happens now when our prophetic DNA is lost, regardless of what the denomination of the church is, but when our prophetic DNA is lost, now we become custodians of complicity. Right? We become the custodians of that. Our doctrine begins to teach that. Our theology begins to teach that and to empower that. And now we find ourselves in the state that we are in now, where much of the church, the black church in particular, has lost sight of what our unique prophetic assignment is.
That's good, because you know what you're saying is that really the thought, when we talk about the thought, we can go all the way back to the garden and see where this thing started, because the enemy is incepting thoughts. He sees thoughts. And so the thought becomes the thing. And so when you're sowing thoughts, which is the mind of God, the reason why we can have a dream, the reason why we can have a vision is because God gave us his thought concerning us, that we will begin to now become uncomfortable in the state that we're in, that we cry out for something that is on the inside of us that's bigger than what we're living in. And he says that cry, when we cry out for what God has shown us, it begins to release the heavens to show up on our behalf in the earth. And we don't stop crying until we see the model and the image of what God put in us to see in order for it to become what he needs it to be. And we need to go back to understanding, where do we get vision? How do we come back to that prophetic edge? When do we understand that it's not about prophesying to people, of the things that they want? I think we go all the way back and we talk about the black church and we talk about how we cried out to get to where we became, is because we knew where we were was smaller than who we were on the inside and what God had shown us we were supposed to be. When you don't see yourself beyond the conditions of your life, you lose perspective for anything greater. And so when people don't have a vision, when people lose dream, the prophetic comes to step into the lives of people to give them the ability to see what they can't see. And so God shows man the ability to see something beyond what they can see, so they can cry out for something, desire something bigger than what they have, so people can see God's mind, his expression, and his will in the earth manifesting through us. And I think that, like what you're saying, to come back to understanding that it starts with being able to become prophetic. We must come back to spiritual reality, that we can begin to see beyond the limitations of what we see in, because we can't see as far as we need to see. And I think somebody can pick this up, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we've been offended, the fact that we sit in unforgiveness. I think one of the biggest issues we deal with in the church is an issue of unforgiveness. And we just can't seem to forgive. It becomes tumors that sits in the hearts, on the walls of our lives, that stop us from moving forward to accomplish what we need to do. And so now when we can't forgive and we have been bound in offense, it's clouding our perspective and our vision of the Spirit, that we can no longer sit in a pure place to receive the mind of God, that maybe God has something greater than what you're living in right now, if you can believe it. And it's going to take not just me, it's going to take all of us coming together to work that to happen, so it can benefit the whole, right? And that's where love starts.
I think we can do that, one, by redefining what the prophetic is, redefining what the apostolic is. And we've got to reintroduce it to the culture through the scriptures through the scriptures, of course, reintroduce it to the culture and the culture of people that we call prophetic and apostolic, to give them the truest identity of what prophets and apostles are. Because when you look at it, what we see in our Western church expression is so far from the margin that it's not funny. So we need a redefining. The redefining has to begin, because when that redefining happens, that's when we're going to experience a rebirth into emergence of real prophets and apostles operating in their functions in the earth.
So let me throw this out for any of you all to hit. Where has our doctrine been informed and been constrained by this, whether it's a covert or an overt attempt and intent to erase our identity, to erase our call as a prophetic people, as a prophetic barometer? And how have we now, we, not necessarily us in particular, but we as a people, become custodians of the very ideas and doctrines that have stripped us of this identity and conviction to be a prophetic people?
The prophetic in itself, when we talk about it, and this is a good subject, because as you're talking about custodians of what God gave us, because the prophet in himself, really our job responsibility, God gave us was to be custodians. We were to custodian the spiritual and supernatural realm, and to help bring that into expression into the earth as a people, saying that we are prophetic. And when we say to bring that back into remembrance of who we always have been. Somewhere we lost through identity and struggle of identity of who we are in Christ Jesus. He made us, first of all, to be kings and priests. And he gave us the thought and the idea as kingdom citizens to be able to rule now in the earth as he ruled through us to impact the lives of people, ruling out of us to deal with societal issues. And so what we are seeing now, because we're falling away from that prophetic scope and that prophetic edge, being spiritual enough to know God's original thought and his intent and his identity for what it was we supposed to get accomplished, we find ourselves not being able to be effective prophetically. We say it, but we're not effective. We talk about the title of being prophet or being apostle when we say redefined it. I think it's been defined, and I think that what we have to do is introduce the original intent back to the house of God that has lost the original intent. When you talk about secession, kingdom was about secession. It was about the continuation. You know, God is not doing nothing new that he's already done. You know, and so what we're doing now is picking back what we fell away from, which is the prophetic, to get a spiritual understanding. So we're no longer bound by culture. We're no longer trying to now be a people that are trying to interpret spiritual things through a natural intelligence, because it's going to get lost in interpretation. But if we can now be bold enough to know who we are and not come back from speaking in the spirit and being able to articulate, and you said something powerful, because I went after articulation. When I got saved, I couldn't understand, because I grew up in the church and I saw and heard a lot of teaching on God, but I saw few demonstrations of God's power in the church. And as I read the Bible, somewhere in me, coming out of Hollywood, you know, I've been around a lot of athletes, entertainers, and I've seen a lot of things that people can rule in the earth with money and having, you know, being able to accomplish things. But when I got saved, I was looking for power. And I thought, well, if God visit me, I was all the way in New York recording. I said, well, God, if you visit me and told me that it was time for me to come back into the house of faith, and you gave me a vision, that was my first prophetic introduction of the spirit realm. God showed me a vision. And when I saw the vision, he showed me the church and told me I was going home. So I had an encounter with angels and demons. I was introduced to God by the realms of the spirit, and I wasn't even in the church. And so don't tell me that there is not the prophetic. It is not regulated to how we conduct our institutionalized religious organizations. The prophetic moves outside of time and space. And so if we can get people to understand that God is moving outside of time and space, and we can now house eternal realms and bring that back into the earth, we can invade what is happening in time. We can call this acceleration that is happening now in the spirit. We can run in the rhythm of it, and we can now, in time, that God he's recovering time, he's redeeming time, to now being able to bring us back to God's original intent in the time that we have to cause manifestation to take place in the now. And I think that's the prophetic movement in power. I think that is what we're after. I think that's what we're talking about and need to demonstrate. People are looking for power. They're looking for the demonstration, not just in healings and miracles. I think the demons are going to find themselves disguising themselves among a lot of these different activities. But I think people are looking for purity. They're looking for language. They're looking for expression. I think many people are having prophetic encounters. They just don't have language. They don't have interpretation, and they don't really understand what it is that they're encountering daily in the lives that they're living. And I think that's what you're and we're after, to try to say, hey, that is what this is. Let's give articulation to it so you can embrace it. I believe what people don't interpret or can comprehend, they can't submit their will to. And so if we can bring comprehension to better understanding the prophetic, we'll find that we have more prophets and apostles among us that are true officers that have not had language because they have not felt there was a place for them to give expression to who they were.
If I can add, let me add this real quick. I think what has happened, the impact of the prophetic has diminished a bit because it's been watered down. It's been where we've had so many people prophesying on behalf of God, right? And it not come to pass. That's a problem. In the Old Testament, this is where thus saith the Lord comes from. You know, it comes from the Old Testament because the prophets that were there, they would say, thus saith the Lord, thus saith Baal, thus saith Ashtaroth, or whatever false god they're speaking on behalf of, to distinguish who they're talking about or who they're talking for. So I see this so much in the church. Thus saith the Lord, this is going to happen. Thus saith the Lord, this is going to happen. Then when it doesn't happen, that's a problem. That's a problem. And we've seen this so much within the church. We've seen the prophetic so watered down. We see it on Facebook Lives every week, prophesying wrong things, right? And it has gotten to the point where people are losing a respect for the prophetic, a respect for the voice of God through people. And I've seen people turn away from the prophetic based on a false prophetic word that somebody said, God said it. I teach and train our prophets, don't say thus said the Lord unless you know he said it. And I go to 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, where Paul was saying basically, hey, this is me speaking as a representative of Christ. And then other times he would say, this is the Lord. So we have to differentiate that. You know, hey, this is what I feel in my spirit toward you. This is what the Lord is saying. Instead of saying, well, God said it and it doesn't happen. That's why so many people have fallen away from the church. They've fallen away from the prophetic, where they would not even follow a prophetic church because they've been so wounded. We got to do better.
I want to jump in and say this, that I believe wholeheartedly that we are fighting against deception and derivatives. It is like layers and layers of deception. And in order for us to get back to the heart of the matter and the purity that we need to get back to, we're going to have to deconstruct, because you can't reintroduce something to a people who are set in a thought, a theory, a way, a perspective. And all of it has to change. And I think what has happened is we've allowed people to teach us according to their culture, according to their experience, and we never explored the reality of them being limited themselves or controlling or being the introduction to deception to us, because we trusted that a perfect place, as we would call it, would not include deception. But the garden was perceived to be a perfect place, but it had deception.
And so part then of our responsibility, and even what we'll get into this conversation, is looking in a broader sense, more than the perversion of the prophetic in terms of words that don't come to pass, a perversion of the prophetic in terms of the scope of what we think the role of the prophet is. And as we look at that, perhaps we'll see that the pressure to perform has given way to much of this perversion of the prophetic ministry. Stay tuned. We're going.